Welcome back after lunch break. Now I'm with Shawn Wildermuth, and in this session, our speaker will demonstrate how to integrate Aspire into a mixed stack application combining .NET and not .NET components. So let's see it in action. And before we begin, a quick reminder for you. If you have any question, please post them into our chat. We'll address them at the end of the talk. And ladies and gentlemen, once again, Shawn Wildermuth. Shawn, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here. Sorry I couldn't come be there in person, but I'm hoping the people watching today can get a little bit out of my talk. Today I want to talk about Aspire. I know a lot of people that are in the .NET space probably already know it or at least have heard of it. So I kind of wanted to teach it in a different way than some of the Microsoft demonstrations. Sorry, can everyone hear me?
Yes, now yes.
Okay, sorry. I don't know how I got muted. So today I want to talk about Aspire. I know that many developers out there have heard of it. Some of them have played with it a little. And I wanted to talk about it from sort of a multi-platform perspective. Because in a lot of these cases, we're not just talking about Microsoft plus Microsoft plus Microsoft plus Microsoft. Very quickly, I'm a Microsoft MVP and a Docker captain, and I live here in the Netherlands. And I think that's all you need to know about me. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about distributed software and why Aspire, I think, is interesting. And then I'm going to go ahead and do a demo to show you how it works with an existing application. So distributed computing, I think, is a good place to start, just to sort of talk about it. And in the very old days, there wasn't anything like distributed computing. You had one giant machine, usually taking over an entire room. And so you really didn't have to think about distributing and talking with different services at one time. Soon after, they had the ability to program them instead of just sort of patch cable them. But soon we wanted to put, some sort of display, not just feeding things in. And this wasn't really distributed yet because you were just having some sort of CLI, some textual representation of what you wanted. But pretty quickly, especially in the 80s, we started to get into the first sort of level of distributed computing. That is some machine that needs to talk to a database. And this was sort of the first step of distributed computing, where you might have the database on another machine, not necessarily on the same machine. And then soon after, someone decided that we needed a tier in between for 3-tier development instead of 2. And this turned into N-tier. And then people started to think, oh, this N-tier needs to be in the cloud. I need to have something remote like a laptop that can communicate to some data center, whether it's in a traditional cloud like we see here, or in a private cloud, or just a data center, as it was called at the time. People ultimately decided, the cloud is good, but I wanted to I want to have it more isolated, and so they started using containers to put together these separate pieces into something like a microservice architecture. The problem with where we've gotten to now is the mantra from a lot of well-meaning people has been microservices can solve a lot of your problems. And a lot of this came out of Netflix. The problem is most of us aren't working at Netflix. Most of us are working on much more humble or simple or straightforward projects. And you wouldn't architect Netflix and a pizza shop application in the same way. And so one of the things that I think is important with Aspire is they can handle both situations. So when we're talking about Aspire, we're not talking about having to use Kubernetes, having to use very heavy-handed tooling to do this. Azure Container Services can do this, but it's also pretty heavy for what you want. And ultimately, we're going to want to figure out what size our application is, because the idea of what we need is very different depending on who our users are. So what does any of this have to do with Aspire? So Aspire is this idea to simplify the development environment. The key benefit here isn't a special new deployment story. The key benefit here is that developing an application, when you start to have different pieces to it, would be simplified by using something like Aspire. This allows you to set up the configuration between the different parts of your application with code, which may be a plus or minus depending on who you are. But if you've ever been in YAML hell, as I call it, trying to configure how different applications work with each other, it's nice that I have an environment that I'm comfortable with. It gives a really good development experience in that it's going to allow you to launch a complex application by just hitting F5 instead of having to set up all these other things so you can focus on the actual work. And some of the services it supports is the idea of service discovery, so a way for one service to know about another. Excuse me, orchestration, which is going to allow us to figure out how a message or a API call or whatever crawls its way through our architecture. And then it does help with deployment, though you really should think of deployment as a nice add-on because it's still going through a lot of work at Microsoft to make the deployment story more interesting. Out of the box, initially, this only supported Azure Container Services, ACS. But you're going to see, even in my talk, that there's a few other ways you can do this, and they're working on even more ways. So if you're like me, whenever I sit in these sort of talks, I want to get to the code. So the rest of this talk is going to be an actual demonstration. So I have this not terribly complex project. It has an API. It has a worker that does some processing for me. Have some common code, and then I have a NPM or a node app. In this case, this is a view app that I need to execute. Normally, before Aspire, I would normally look at, let's see if we can go to properties. I would tell it how I want to start these processes. I would set this up as multiple projects. You'll notice that my solution is set up as the startup project, not one of the individual projects. And there's no real story here for starting the node application. So a couple things have to happen. I first need to run the node application. Good, that's running. And then I can press F5 on the rest of this. And so if I go to my node application, my node application, of course, that's not where it's at. A couple of you might have noticed that I've been doing some Angular lately. That's why 4200 came up. And so I have this running application. I can debug it. Ordinarily, I might go to my View app and I might open it in Visual Studio Code and do the work there. So that doesn't change a whole lot, but it is something for you to kind of be aware of. Now, the way this works is tenuous. There isn't really a way to share how you want to start and stop these applications and monitor them. Monitoring them becomes just looking at the output of the console app that was running. And I'm not a big fan of especially how those work together. So the solution I'm going to imply is let's go ahead and add a new project. Now, for an existing project, you can add a new project. You can also create a starter application or an empty application as a starting point for your new development. But I'm just going to add host to my existing project. And I'm going to call it shoe money, which is the name of my project, and I'll just call it host or app host or whatever you want. And you notice that because I have Aspire installed, it's going to let me use certain versions. And these versions are not tied to the .NET version. So 9.3 works with 8.0. Will work with 10.0 once that's supported. But I'm going to use the latest version of Aspire 9.3, which was released a little while ago. But do realize that they are being released separately, the .NET version as well as the Aspire version. So going forward, you'll still be able to use Aspire 9.4 or even Aspire 10 when it releases with older versions of the framework. So you don't have to bring everything just to get this benefit. And so we have this. I'm going to close all tabs. We have this host, and I'm going to make this my startup project. And if I just run this as a startup project, I haven't done any real work yet. Should have started my project. Hold on, let me make sure that it's set up to launch our project. Just the properties again. There it goes. And just running the project, what the host's job is to provide a dashboard for your application as it runs. Now, we haven't defined any resources, but you can see some of the things it does. This allows you to get at the console of these different apps, look at structured logging, look at traces, look at metrics. So you're getting a view of the entire application. But of course, this doesn't have any resources, so let's not care quite yet. I'm going to open the apphost.cs, which is the startup. You can think of it as the program.cs for the host. And you'll see that it's created this distributed application builder for us. And this is where we can set up our different applications. And we have the API project, we have the order processing, and we have the store. But let's start with the 2.NET project. So I'm going to grab the API project. I'm going to drag it on top of the host. That'll just make a project reference for me, and do the same with order processing. And once I have those references, I can use the builder to say add project. And this project is going to be projects underscore and I'm going to add the API project. And here you need to give it a name to identify it, and I'll just call it API. I can do the same thing with the other one, add project, projects.host. Nope. Projects.order processing. We don't need to add the host there. Order processing, for lack of a better name. And now that I've added them, what happens when I press F5? Is that it is now running it. And in fact, it's running it in the background, and I can go ahead and look at the URLs or look at the console logs for this. So it gives me this one place to sort of manage these. And if there's errors, we could go down into those errors. And it knows, because of the project type, that I have, I'm going to make this a little smaller so you can see it, have multiple URLs that will take me to the API. Order processing doesn't have any URLs because it's a background worker process. It doesn't have any UI associated with it. And that's fine. And if we go to, let's say the one here, let's just go API products. You can see we're actually getting the products through the API. The API is running fine. So you could have done that on your own. That's not all that interesting. as we work with different projects that aren't .NET, we might want to be able to add things like the store, right? So in order to add the store, we're going to need a package about working with Node projects. So you can go to Manage NuGet packages and just search for Aspire. But one of the things that's a little helpful here is add Aspire package. And this just opens up NuGet with some filters in here for only needing the Aspire things. And for us, there's that Node.js. I'm going to install it into the host. Of course, read those details in the license every time, as you know you should. And then if I come back over here, now that I have it, I can say add npm app. And I'm going to give it a name, and I'm going to call it the client. And the working directory is going to be, I forget what the working directory is supposed to be. Yeah. Down one directory and then store shoemoney.store. So that's the directory that we're going to run the npm app in. And I'm going to say npm run dev. I'm going to just say dev for the script name. This knows that it's an npm project, and it's going to launch this in a console using the dev script, because I happen to, if we look at the package.json, there's a script here called dev, and that's what I actually want it to run. And with all of that, now we have all three running, but the client doesn't have an URL. Well, we know it has an URL. We just haven't told it to expose it. Just to be clear, we can see that the console log is actually running. The npm project is actually running, which is all good. How are we doing on time? I just want to make sure I don't run too late. We can see that they're all running, and that's great. But we'll have extension methods here to change the behavior. So here I'm going to say with HTTP endpoints. And here I'm going to say that I just want to set whatever the port is in the project. So port is going to be an environment variable that's going to be set part of the environment, so that this is going to actually take the port from the npm app. Run it one more time. Now we can see that it's created an endpoint, not with the original port, but a randomized port that it uses so that you can run multiple view apps without having to necessarily have port collision. And if we run this, we're actually seeing it fail because it doesn't know where to find the API. This is where some of the magic of making these work together. So we can add here as well with reference, and we can give it a reference to the API. So let's call this the API. I'm going to get what returns here so they can just tell it that I need to have a reference to that API. Therefore, I can know how to get at it. Now, if we run it, still doesn't work, but I'll show you what that add reference does. If we look at the client here, we can view details, and this will give us a list of all of the settings that are being set. And the one that's important here is these services.http and services HTTPS. These were added, you'll notice the little API name in the middle there, as an environment variable that's passed to our project. And so what we can do is, this is particular to the way that Vite works. Oops, that's not the right one. We can actually port that by specifying what the service name is. And here we're getting that environment variable that was sent by the host to know where the URL to the server is. So the magic that's happening here is it's pushing this configuration to the other project so that when we go here, even though these may not be fixed URLs, they may be random URLs, right? This should still work because it's been given where that URL is. So the app doesn't need to have a fixed knowing exactly what port and what machine this is on. It's being handed it to it so that all of this can continue to work. Let's take this one step further. Talk about other configuration, because just having the configuration for, whoops, I didn't mean to close that post. For the URL of a project, we might want to have other resources like a connection string. And here we can say builder.add connection string, and I'm going to give it the name of a connection string. In this case, it's going to be, I'm going to steal it from one of the other projects, the Shoe Money database. And by adding that connection there, we can then, unsurprisingly, say with reference to connection string. Whoops. And we can do that same thing here. Whoops, let me take that back. I always put it on the wrong thing. We'll add it to the API here, so we have a central place that our connection string is defined. In this case, it'll be in an app.settings in our host project, but it could be from all different sorts of sources. And we're going to add it here as well. So that we have one source of truth. Now, currently, this is going to get it from the app.settings JSON. And so I'm just going to add it here in JSON, but in the API, and this is not super kosher, but it should work. I'm going to take it out of the API so that it only gets it from the centralized connection string. This is one of the powers of what we're talking about. We can read through this and see really what it's sort of building on. And so if we go to the web app to make sure it still works, it still works. And it still works because the API now, we look at its details, even if it has its own app.config with a connection string, we're telling it this is going to be an environment variable that contains what you guessed, the connection string to that. And this will override, unless you specifically change the way the configuration works, this will override any settings that are in the actual project. And so some of the ideas that this should be helping you figure out, let me see how we're doing on time. Yeah, good. Is that we want central single points of truth for a complex application. And you can imagine an application like this that you're working on in your own company, getting all these things to talk to each other in a certain way without hard coding strings or sharing .env files or whatever the case may be, can be complex. And this really simplifies it because it ties into the very same ideas. And so let's talk about, I referenced sort of third party or just Microsoft stacks. And I certainly have this with a Node app here. But let's say I wanted to actually create a cache. Now I'm going to need a new, I shouldn't have closed it, a new reference for this. So I'm going to go over to the Aspire package. And I want to install Redis in my application. So I'm going to use Redis as a cache. And so now that I have it, I should be able to say builder add Redis, and I'll just call that a cache. And I'm actually going to say with Redis Commander as well, which is a UI for you to manage it. This would be useful only in development, but this will allow us to, in this simple idea, just run these. And if we go ahead and run this, you'll see the cache and the cache commander are there, but they're taking a little bit to start up. Now, what are these? You can see the source isn't these projects. It's actually a Docker image. And if we look at, so this will be an easier way to show it. We'll look at Docker Desktop. You'll actually see that these are individual containers that were built. They have some sample numbers back here, but ignore the ones down here because those are just ones that I have running in general. But it created the caches and the cache commander for me. And if I stop the project, you see that these are quickly torn down, or sometimes less quickly torn down. And so you don't have to know how to set this up in Docker. You're just saying, I want a Redis cache. And then over here in the API, I might want to actually use that cache. So there are references on the other side of the wire, if you want to think of it in that way. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new, or add a new project. And here I'm going to say, oh, there's that Redis Stack Exchange. I'm going to go ahead and include it. You notice it starts with Aspire. Because instead of needing to know exactly all the configuration for that piece, I can then come in here and just say builder.add Redis client and give it that name, which was cache. And now you can use the key cache or the distributed cache, whichever you end up using in your application. And the magic here of it being in the client is we're being pushed any configuration information. We don't need this application to know about or add configuration settings. It just works. Now, I don't have any caching actually in use here, but you'll have to trust me on that. I want to leave a couple minutes for questions. And so I'm going to abbreviate this a little bit. This is usually an hour talk, so there's only so much I can do. Oh, yeah. Of course, I forgot the most important part, which is with reference cache. I need to pass in that cache to the projects that are going to use it. Order processing doesn't use a cache. Mostly only the catalog is going to want the cache, so I don't have to do a database hit each and every time it's requested. Now, one of the problems we have is that because this is starting a Docker container, this might start to use it before it's ready. And so, let me get rid of it. Oh no, that's the queue I had from earlier. One of the things we can do is say, you know what, this may take longer to start up. So I can also say, and this is fairly new in 9.2, I think, when this was added, wait for, and I'm going to wait for the cache before I start up. So this is going to create a dependency on cache so that this has to be started before this starts. Now the cache starts pretty quickly, so we may not be able to see it, but let's hope. So here you can see these are running, and eventually this caught up. Because this is dependent on the cache, not on cache commander, so unfortunately you really couldn't see that happening. You'll have to trust me. If the other piece here that I think is important for you to know is you can also, this is a container, maybe you don't want to tear it down every time. You can actually add with lifetime. And in this case, this allows you to either have a per session base, which is the default, tear down and post up, or persistent. And all that persistent does is launch it when you need it, and it'll keep it running. So every subsequent call this should already be running. You see it's starting up. And you can see now that it's persistent because we now have that little icon there. I'm going to go ahead and, come on, go away. Oh, that's RabbitMQ. Of course it is. What was the piece I was trying to show you? Not that. So this will fail on us, which is okay because I want to actually show you something. See if it actually fails. Yeah. I'm going to let it fail because now we, whoops. Where did, when it moves it to the last. So here we can see, oh, there's an error there. In fact, we can look at the console and see, oh, it couldn't connect to the RabbitMQ, which I had stopped in Docker Desktop. But that's not all you can see. You can actually see the structured logs as they're set up. And so we can see the relationship between how these are done. And if you've set up traces or metrics, those will also be there, though. Right now, we don't have a ton of metrics set up. You can see that we can see what the metrics were for different parts because we turned on certain metrics, and yeah, I didn't define any traces yet. So this not only gives you the idea of having a dashboard, and really, as you're developing, you can see the relationship between these different systems that you're trying to put together. I don't think I'll have time to cover the publishing, but I do have a number of videos out on YouTube, coding shorts that cover that part, and so you might want to go look at them. But I think it's probably a good time for, let's go back to the slides real quick. Those aren't the slides you're looking for. Any questions?
Okay, thank you very much, Shawn, for your presentation. If you can turn on your camera because we lost during presentation.
Oh, sorry about that.
Okay, and I see one question from Krzysztof, and Krzysztof asks, are there challenges with multi-repositories, so repo per service, somehow addressed already?
So the question is, I think, about Git repositories, correct?
Yes.
If it is, you're just making references to other files in the system. It doesn't know or care about whether they're in a single or multi or mono repo. More likely, this is going to be in one repo, but there's nothing technically that requires that, because the Git part of it is more about storing the changes to your project. Aspire itself doesn't know or care anything about Git.
Okay, and I will check again our chat if we have any question. And I don't see any other question. So Shawn, thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you all of you for participation in this session. And as always, don't forget to rate the Shawn's lecture using the stars under the video player. And as you see, you can also use a QR code visible on your screens. So thank you very much again, and see you on the next session.
Thanks, everyone.